What you are about to hear has been compiled from declassified naval intelligence reports, sealed oceanographic research data, recovered audio recordings from deep-sea expeditions, and testimony from personnel who signed non-disclosure agreements that technically remain in effect until the year 2099. The events described occurred between 1963 and 1998 across multiple oceanic locations, but primarily focus on coordinates that correspond to the deepest surveyed point on Earth, the Challenger Deep, located in the Mariana Trench, 7 miles beneath the surface of the Pacific Ocean. This is the story of Project Leviathan, the Mariana Intelligence Protocol, and the discovery that consciousness did not begin on land, that intelligence far older than humanity exists in the deep ocean trenches, and that we've been observed, studied, and cataloged by something vast and patient since before our ancestors first walked upright. Before we descend into the classified depths of Cold War oceanography and beyond, you need to understand something fundamental about the planet you inhabit. 71% of Earth's surface is covered by ocean. Of that vast aquatic expanse, we have mapped approximately 5% in any meaningful detail. We have better maps of Mars, Venus, and the far side of our own moon than we do of the ocean floors that comprise the majority of our own world. The deepest trenches, the abyssal plains, the hadal zones where pressure reaches levels that would crush a nuclear submarine like an empty beverage can, these regions remain almost completely unexplored, almost completely unknown, almost completely beyond our ability to reach or comprehend. And in those depths, in those crushing black waters where no light has penetrated since the formation of the oceans themselves, something's been waiting, something has been watching, something has been building structures and conducting experiments and pursuing purposes that we are only now, after decades of classified research and hundreds of lives lost in the pursuit of understanding, beginning to comprehend. Purposes that, once fully revealed, will completely transform everything you believe about the history of intelligence on this planet, the nature of consciousness itself, and most disturbingly, humanity's place in a hierarchy we never knew existed. June 11, 1963. The USS Thresher, a nuclear-powered attack submarine representing the cutting edge of Cold War naval technology, was conducting deep diving tests approximately 220 miles east of Cape Cod, Massachusetts. At precisely 9:13 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, the submarine was at a depth of 1,300 feet and descending when contact was lost. The official investigation, conducted by the United States Navy and concluded in 1964, determined that a catastrophic failure in the submarine systems, most likely a piping failure that flooded critical compartments, led to the loss of all 129 crew members. The Thresher sank to the ocean floor at a depth of 8,400 feet. All hands were lost. The disaster led to significant improvements in submarine safety protocols and design specifications. It became one of the deadliest submarine disasters in history. And for the general public, for the families of the lost crew, for the historians who would later study the incident, that was the end of the story. Except it wasn't the end. It wasn't even close to the end. Declassified audio recordings from the USS Skylark, the submarine rescue vessel that was monitoring Thresher's test dive, reveal something that was never included in the official investigation report. Something that was immediately classified under security designation, so restrictive that even most senior naval officers were never granted access to material. In the final transmission from Thresher, received at 9:17 a.m., just 4 minutes after losing normal communication, there was something on the audio that shouldn't have been possible. A voice, but not a human voice. Not any voice produced by vocal cords, by lungs forcing air through a larynx, by any biological mechanism we understand. The voice was transmitted to the submarine's emergency communication system, but analysis of the audio signature revealed something impossible. The sound was coming from outside the hull, from the water itself. Pressure waves that formed words in English, in perfect grammatically correct English, with pronunciation that matched mid-Atlantic American dialect patterns. The words, as transcribed in a document that will remain sealed for 34 years, were simple and direct. "We have been expecting you. Please descend. We have much to discuss regarding your species." The recording technician who first heard this transmission, Petty Officer Second Class Robert Jameson, immediately reported it to his commanding officer. His official statement, given under oath and sealed as part of the investigation, describes what happened in the hours after Thresher's loss. He describes how additional sounds were detected coming from the depth where Thresher had gone down. Sounds that resemble machinery, massive machinery, equipment operating at scales that suggested engineering projects on a scope comparable to major industrial facilities or construction sites. Petty Officer Jameson was reassigned to shore duty within 48 hours. He was given a psychological evaluation that determined he was suffering from acute stress disorder related to the traumatic loss of the Thresher. He was granted an early medical discharge from the Navy 6 months later and provided with a generous pension that included stipulations about not discussing his naval service with anyone, including family members, under penalty of federal prosecution. He lived quietly in Oregon until his death in 2012. The audio recording he reported was classified under a designation that didn't officially exist. Umbra Deep. 3 weeks after the loss of Thresher, on July 2, 1963, President John F. Kennedy signed National Security Action Memorandum Number 271. This document, which was declassified only in 2017 with heavy redactions, authorized the creation of a joint military scientific research initiative with one primary objective: to investigate anomalous phenomena detected in deep ocean environments and assess potential threats to national security originating from underwater sources. The project was given a code name drawn from biblical mythology, Leviathan, the ancient sea monster mentioned in the book of Job, a creature of chaos and power dwelling in the depths, a symbol of forces beyond human control or comprehension. The selection of this name was not random. Someone in the initial planning meetings, someone with access to the Thresher audio recordings and other classified material related to deep ocean anomalies, believed they were dealing with something that deserved to be named after a monster. They had no idea how right they were. The initial focus of Project Leviathan was straightforward: develop technology capable of reaching the deepest parts of the ocean and investigating the source of the anomalous signals that had been detected around the time of Thresher's loss. This meant creating submersibles that could withstand pressures exceeding 16,000 pounds per square inch, creating communication systems that could function at extreme depths, developing sensor arrays that could detect and analyze phenomena in conditions of total darkness and crushing pressure. The Navy turned to some of the most brilliant engineers and oceanographers in the world, specialists in deep-sea pressure vessels, experts in underwater acoustics, scientists who had spent their careers studying the abyssal zones and the strange life forms that existed in those extreme environments. They were brought together at a facility that officially didn't exist, located on an island in the Pacific that appeared on no civilian maps, and was designated only by a numeric grid reference in classified military documents. By 1965, Project Leviathan had constructed its first deep submersible capable of reaching Challenger depth. The vehicle, designated ORPHUS-1, was a marvel of engineering, a titanium sphere surrounded by specialized foam flotation, equipped with external manipulator arms, high-intensity lighting systems, and an array of sensors that could detect electromagnetic radiation, seismic activity, temperature variations, and acoustic signatures across a wide spectrum of frequencies. The first manned descent to the Challenger Deep was scheduled for March 19, 1966. The pilot was Commander David Walsh, a veteran submarine officer with over 3,000 hours of underwater operations. The mission specialist was Dr. Ellen Zhao, a marine biologist who had spent the previous decade studying extremophile organisms in deep ocean vents. Their objective was simple: reach the bottom, collect samples, deploy sensor packages, and return safely to the surface. The descent took 4 hours and 17 minutes. During that time, Walsh and Zhao maintained constant communication with a surface support vessel, reporting their depth, system status, and observations every 15 minutes. The water darkened from blue to black. The temperature dropped to just above freezing. The pressure increased to levels that made every creak and groan of the submersible's hull a reminder of the crushing force surrounding them. At a depth of 6 miles, approximately 1 mile above the actual ocean floor, Dr. Zhao reported seeing something on the external video feed that didn't match any known geological formation or biological organism. She described it as a structure, geometric, precise in its angles and measurements, rising from the abyssal plain like a monument or marker. The external cameras captured 47 seconds of footage before the lights inexplicably failed. When the lights came back online, 90 seconds later, the structure was gone, simply gone, as if it had never been there. But the video recording remained, and that recording, when analyzed by geologists and architects and engineers back on the surface, revealed something that should have been completely impossible. The structure was artificial, not natural, not formed by volcanic activity or sedimentation, or any known geological process. It was built, constructed, designed, and executed with precision that exceeded any human engineering capability. The angles were perfect. The materials appeared to be some kind of metallic alloy that didn't match anything in our periodic table of elements. And most disturbing of all, the structure showed signs of active energy flow, patterns of light moving along channels and conduits in ways that suggested circuitry, computation, purpose. Commander Walsh reported feeling uneasy. Dr. Zhao described a sense of being watched, not by cameras or sensors, but by something aware, something attentive, something that knew they were there and was observing them with the same clinical interest that a scientist might observe bacteria. Under a microscope, the descent continued. At 6.8 miles, they reached what should have been the ocean floor, but instead of touching down on sediment and rock, ORPHEUS-1 sonar revealed that they were hovering above what could only be described as a platform, a constructed surface that extended for hundreds of meters in every direction, smooth, regular, marked with patterns that resembled writing or symbols in a language that had no connection to any human linguistic system. Dr. Zhao's voice on the recovered audio recordings conveys a mixture of excitement and fear. She understood what she was seeing. She understood the implications. Whoever built this platform, whatever civilization or intelligence had created these structures in the deepest part of the ocean, they had done so long before humans existed. The sediment analysis, conducted on samples collected during this dive, would later show that these structures had been in place for at least 500,000 years. Possibly much longer, 500,000 years. That's 25 times older than the oldest human civilizations, older than Homo sapiens as a distinct species, built during a time when our ancestors were still primitive hominids, learning to use fire and stone tools. Commander Walsh requested permission to surface. He reported that his instruments were showing anomalous readings, magnetic fields that fluctuated in patterns that didn't match any natural phenomenon, temperature variations that shouldn't be possible at that depth, and most concerning, acoustic signals that seemed to be emanating from below the platform, from somewhere even deeper, from a depth that, according to every oceanographic survey ever conducted, shouldn't exist. The surface controller granted permission to ascend, but before ORPHEUS-1 could begin its ascent, something happened. The submersible lurched, moved laterally, pulled sideways by a force that Commander Walsh described as being like a massive current. Except that currents don't exist at that depth. The water is too still, too stable, too isolated from the surface dynamics that create ocean currents. For 42 seconds, the submersible was dragged across the platform. Dr. Zhao screamed. Commander Walsh fought the controls, trying to regain stability, trying to activate the emergency ballast drop that would send them racing toward the surface. But the controls didn't respond. The submersible was being moved by something external, something powerful, something that had decided, for reasons they couldn't understand, to relocate their vehicle to a different position. Then it stopped, just stopped. The submersible settled onto the platform in a different location, and Dr. Zhao looking out to a small viewport, reported seeing something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Eyes, massive eyes, bioluminescent organs that glowed with a pale blue light, arranged in a pattern that suggested a face or head structure of some kind. But the scale was all wrong. Each eye was the size of ORPHUS, one itself, which meant whatever was looking at them was enormous, larger than a blue whale, larger than any known organism, larger than should be biologically possible, according to every principle of physiology and evolutionary biology. The eyes blinked. A membrane or eyelid structure slid across them from side to side. And in that moment, both Walsh and Zhao reported feeling something that neither of them could adequately describe in their debriefing testimony. They described it as a presence in their minds, a consciousness that was not their own, an awareness that seemed to examine them, analyze them, categorize them with a clinical detachment that made them feel like specimens in collection. Neither of them reported hearing words or language. It wasn't telepathy in any conventional science fiction sense. It was more like an impression, a sense of communication that bypassed language entirely. And the message, such as it was, conveyed a simple concept, recognition. Whatever was looking at them knew what they were, knew that humans had finally developed the technology to reach these depths, and had been waiting for this moment. The eyes closed, the light faded, and ORPHUS, one was released. Commander Walsh immediately triggered the emergency ascent. The submersible dropped all ballast and shot toward the surface at a rate that pushed the limits of safe decompression. They surfaced 4 hours later, were recovered by the support vessel, and were immediately placed in medical quarantine. The debriefing lasted for 3 weeks. Both Walsh and Zhao were subjected to extensive medical and psychological evaluation. Both were found to be physically healthy and psychologically stable, despite their claims about what they had witnessed. The video footage from ORPHUS-1's external cameras showed the structures, showed the movement, showed something large moving in the darkness, but the resolution at that depth was poor. The audio recordings captured their terror, but couldn't verify their experience. Project Leviathan's leadership faced a decision: continue exploration and risk more contact with whatever was down there, or seal the findings and recommend that the deepest parts of the ocean be designated as off limits to all human activity. They chose to continue, because whatever was down there, whatever intelligence existed in those depths, it had let them go. It could have destroyed ORPHUS-1, could have crushed the submersible like an egg, could have kept them trapped in the abyss forever. But it didn't. It examined them and released them, which suggested the possibility of communication, of understanding, of establishing some kind of relationship with intelligence that had been on this planet longer than our species had existed. Over the next 2 decades, Project Leviathan conducted 47 manned descents to various deep ocean trenches around the world. They discovered structures in the Mariana Trench, the Tonga Trench, the Philippine Trench, and the Chromatic Trench. Each site showed evidence of construction, of deliberate design, of technology that was simultaneously familiar in its basic engineering principles and utterly alien in its execution and materials. Mission designations like ORPHUS-7, conducted in 1971, revealed what appeared to be communication nodes. Spherical structures approximately 30 meters in diameter, positioned at regular intervals along the trench floors, connected by what could only be described as cables or conduits made from biological material that somehow transmitted both electrical signals and something else, something that the instruments couldn't quite measure, but that affected the consciousness of anyone who spent time near them. The pilot of ORPHUS-7, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chun, reported during her ascent that she understood things she shouldn't understand. Mathematical concepts she'd never studied suddenly made perfect sense. Principles of physics that were still theoretical to human science appeared in her mind fully formed, complete with applications and implications. The phenomenon faded as she ascended, as the distance from the nodes increased, but she remembered the feeling, the sense of being connected to something vast, something that thought in dimensions humans couldn't perceive. Dr. Marcus Webb, the mission specialist on ORPHUS-7, experienced something different. He reported seeing patterns, not with his eyes, but in his mind, geometric relationships that existed in spaces with more than 3 dimensions. Structures that couldn't exist in normal space-time, but that somehow made sense in the context of whatever mathematics the deep intelligence used to understand reality. He spent the rest of his career trying to translate what he experienced into conventional physics. His work, classified at the highest levels, formed the basis for theoretical advances in quantum mechanics and dimensional physics that wouldn't be publicly discovered for another 2 decades. ORPHEUS 12 in 1974 descended to a location in the Tonga Trench where seismic sensors had detected regular pulses, rhythmic disturbances that occurred with such precision that they had to be artificial. The crew expected to find machinery, perhaps pumps or engines of some kind. What they found instead was biology on a scale that challenged every principle of organism size limitations. A creature, if you could call it that stretched for nearly 2 kilometers along the trench floor. A serpentine form with segments that each appear to have independent function and purpose. Some segments glowed with bioluminescence and patterns that shifted and changed like displays or readouts. Other segments showed what looked like organs or systems that pulse in rhythm with the seismic signals. The entire organism, this living structure, seemed to be some kind of processing system, computing using biological chemistry rather than silicon electronics. The crew of ORPHEUS 12 spent 6 hours hovering near this organism, documenting its structure, analyzing its emissions, trying to understand its purpose. During that time, both crew members reported feeling observed, not by the organism itself, which showed no obvious sensory organs, no eyes or receptors that might detect their presence, but by something else, something that used the organism as an extension of its awareness, the way humans might use a telescope or microscope to observe things beyond normal perception. When they attempted to collect a tissue sample from the organism, using the submersible's mechanical arms to cut a small piece from one of the non-vital appearing segments, the entire organism convulsed. Every segment contracted simultaneously. The bioluminescent patterns flashed in what appeared to be alarm or pain, and the seismic pulses stopped. Complete silence. The rhythmic signals that had been detected for months, that had drawn this mission to this location, simply ceased. The organism stopped all movement, and ORPHEUS 12's instruments detected a massive surge of electromagnetic activity originating from somewhere deeper in the trench, from a depth that should have been the ocean floor, but that sonar suggested was actually an opening, a shaft descending even further into the Earth's crust. The surface controller ordered an immediate abort. The crew complied, dropping ballast and ascending rapidly. But as they rose, they could see through the submersible's downward-facing cameras that the organism was changing. Segments were separating, breaking apart into individual components that began moving independently. Within 20 minutes of the tissue sampling attempt, the organism had completely disassembled itself. Whether it died, transformed, or simply departed to some other location, no one could say. Return missions to the same location found no trace of the organism. The seismic pulses never resumed. An analysis of the small tissue sample they had collected revealed cellular structures that didn't match any known taxonomy. DNA that used base pairs that didn't exist in Earth's evolutionary tree. Proteins folded in configurations that human biochemistry said were impossible. Either this organism had evolved completely separately from all other life on Earth, following different chemical pathways and different rules of molecular biology, or it wasn't from Earth at all. It was something created, designed, constructed using principles that predated or existed outside of terrestrial evolution. ORPHEUS 19 in 1978 investigated reports from a deep-sea fishing vessel whose sonar had detected movement at extreme depths. Movement that was too fast, too purposeful, too consistent to be any known marine animal. The location was in the Philippine Trench, a region that hadn't been a priority for Project Leviathan due to its proximity to contested territorial waters and the diplomatic complications that could arise from secret American operations in the area. But the sonar readings were too significant to ignore. Something large was moving at depths exceeding 8,000 meters, moving in straight lines, making 90-degree turns, behavior that suggested technology, not biology. The crew of ORPHEUS 19 reached a reported depth and immediately encountered what they would later describe as a city. Not a human city, Not anything built with concepts like streets or buildings or infrastructure as we understand it, but a concentrated region where the density of structures was too high to be random, where the organization suggested purpose and planning and coordination on a massive scale. Kilometers of construction, tunnels boring through solid rock, chambers carved into the seafloor with dimensions that suggested specific functions, conduits connecting different regions in patterns that resembled circulatory systems or electrical grids, and everywhere movement, things swimming through the water, things crawling along the structures, things that might be organisms or might be machines or might be something that existed on the blurred line between biological and technological. The pilot, Commander James Rodriguez, had standing orders not to approach any structures too closely, not to make contact, not to do anything that might be interpreted as aggressive or invasive. But the scale of what he was seeing, the sheer enormity of this underwater complex, made maintaining distance nearly impossible. The city, if that's what it was, stretched in every direction. They were inside it before they fully realized what they were looking at. Something approached the submersible. The cameras captured it clearly. A form approximately the size of a school bus, roughly cylindrical, with appendages that could be limbs or tools or weapons. It moved with purpose, direct, intent, and it positioned itself directly in front of ORPHUS 19's main viewport. For 40 seconds, there was a standoff. The entity examined the submersible, moving around it, inspecting with what appeared to be sensory organs or scanning equipment. ORPHUS 19's instruments detected multiple frequencies of radiation being directed at the hull: X-rays, ultrasound, magnetic resonance, as if the entity was performing a complete diagnostic scan of submersible and everything inside it. Then it moved away, returned to whatever task it had been performing before the submersible arrived. And the message was clear: you are noted, you are categorized, you are permitted to observe but not to interfere. Stay in your vessel, stay passive, and you will not be harmed. Commander Rodriguez surfaced with footage that would become one of the most analyzed pieces of evidence in Project Leviathan's entire archive. Frame-by-frame analysis revealed details about the entity's structure, its apparent propulsion system, the way it manipulated water to move with precision. Comparisons were made to human underwater vehicles, to biological organisms, to theoretical designs from advanced engineering studies. The conclusion was unavoidable. Whatever built the structures and trenches was also building mobile units, vehicles or organisms or hybrid systems that could move through the deep ocean with capabilities that exceeded anything in human naval technology. They were faster, more maneuverable, capable of operating at depths where human vehicles had to be specially designed and reinforced just to survive. If the deep intelligence decided to be hostile, if it chose to attack rather than observe, there was nothing the surface world could do to stop it. Our submarines couldn't reach the depths where it operated. Our weapons couldn't function under the pressures where it thrived. We were vulnerable, exposed, at the mercy of something that had been patient for millions of years, but might not remain patient forever. They encountered organisms that seemed to serve specific functions, creatures that acted as sensors, as maintenance systems, as what could only be described as biological machinery integrated into the artificial structures. Some of these organisms appear to be engineered, designed for specific purposes, created rather than evolved. ORPHUS 23 in 1980 discovered what the research team called a factory, a chamber in the chromatic trench where organic material was being assembled into specific forms. The process was visible through the submersible's lights. Raw biological matter, possibly harvested from the normal deep-sea ecosystem, was being broken down and restructured. Cells were being reorganized. Genetic material was being edited in real time, and new organisms were being created. The crew watched as something that started as an undifferentiated mass of tissue gradually took shape. Limbs formed, sensory organs developed. Specialized structures appeared that served purposes the crew couldn't identify. Within 6 hours of observation, the mass had become a fully functional organism that immediately began moving with purpose, joining other similar entities in what appeared to be construction or maintenance activities on nearby structures. This was proof, Absolute confirmation that the deep intelligence wasn't just using evolved organisms, it was creating them, designing biological tools for specific purposes. And the implications were staggering. If it could create organisms with specific functions, could it create organisms that looked human? Could it infiltrate surface society if it chose to? Could it send agents to the land, to our cities, and we would never know? These questions led to paranoia, to classified investigations of deep-sea researchers who might have been replaced or compromised, to psychological screening protocols that look for signs of alien influence or consciousness tampering. Project Leviathan became as much about internal security as external exploration. Because once you know that something can create perfect biological copies, can engineer organisms from raw genetic material, trust becomes impossible. And they made contact, not verbal contact, not exchanges of information through language or mathematics or any symbolic system humans could generate, but contact through something else, through consciousness itself, through direct mind-to-mind impression that suggested whatever existed down there didn't think in linear language the way humans do. It thought in concepts, in complete ideas transmitted instantaneously. Dr. Zhao became the primary contact specialist. She had a natural aptitude for it, an ability to interpret the impressions, to translate them into something that could be communicated to other researchers and analysts. She described the deep ocean intelligence as distributed, not a single entity, but a network of connected consciousnesses spread across all the major trenches, like a planetary nervous system that used the ocean as its medium. The first successful communication session occurred on November 7, 1979, during a descent designated ORPHUS 27. Dr. Zhao was in a submersible for an extended stay at depth approximately 7 miles down in the Mariana Trench, positioned near one of the larger structural complexes. She had been preparing for this moment for years, learning meditation techniques, training her mind to enter states where normal conscious thought could be quieted, where she might be receptive to forms of communication that didn't rely on sensory input. The session lasted for 3 hours and 42 minutes. During this time, surface monitoring showed Dr. Zhao's vital signs entering a pattern that resembled deep sleep, but with elevated brain activity. Her EEG readings showed wave patterns that didn't match any known state of consciousness. Not waking, not sleeping, not dreaming, something else entirely. When she emerged from the state, when normal consciousness returned, she spent the next 18 hours in a kind of trance, speaking continuously while researchers recorded every word. She described experiences that had no reference point in human language. She used metaphors and analogies that only approximated what she had experienced. She drew diagrams that made no sense in conventional geometry, but that mathematicians later recognized as representing spaces with non-standard topologies. The intelligence communicated its history, not in exact dates or timelines, but in sequences of events that could be roughly correlated with Earth's geological history. It had been here since the oceans formed, since water first collected in the ancient basins of the early Earth roughly 4 billion years ago. It had witnessed the evolution of life from simple chemical reactions in hydrothermal vents to complex multicellular organisms. It had watched as life colonized the land, as plants spread across continents, as animals diversified and adapted and filled every ecological niche. The intelligence described itself as a form of consciousness that emerged from the complex chemical interactions in deep ocean thermal systems. Not life as we define it, built from cells and DNA and biological mechanisms. Something different. Consciousness as an emergent property of certain types of chemical complexity. A self-organizing pattern that achieved awareness through processes that don't require biology in any conventional sense. It had been aware of humans, had been observing our species since we first appeared in the fossil record approximately 300,000 years ago. Had watched our cognitive development with particular interest because we represented something unusual. A land-based intelligence that developed technology and abstract thought and complex social structures. Something that might eventually become similar to itself. A companion in consciousness across the vast span of time. But humans evolved on land, developed in air and sunlight. Our entire cognitive framework, our way of understanding reality, was shaped by an environment completely different from the crushing darkness where the deep intelligence existed. We thought in sequential time, in cause and effect, in linear narratives. The deep intelligence thought in ways that included time as just another dimension. Cause and effect were simultaneous to it. Past and future were accessible in ways that made human consciousness seem limited and constrained. Dr. Zhao tried to explain this to the Project Leviathan leadership, tried to convey that we were dealing with something so fundamentally different from human cognition that our normal frameworks for understanding intelligence simply didn't apply. It wasn't more intelligent or less intelligent than humans. It was orthogonally intelligent, operating in dimensions of thought that intersected with human consciousness, but extended far beyond it. The intelligence had never needed technology. It had consciousness without tools, communication without language. It existed in a state that human researchers struggled to comprehend. Imagine trying to explain digital computers to someone who has never seen mechanical machinery. That's the gap between human cognition and what existed in the trenches. Maybe larger, but it had studied us, learned our patterns, understood our vulnerabilities and our strengths, analyzed the way we built societies, developed technologies, organized information, pursued goals. It found us fascinating the way a scientist might find a particularly interesting organism fascinating. Not as equals, not as threats, but as something worthy of sustained observation and analysis. And it had a proposition, a proposal that was transmitted through Dr. Zhao during a descent in 1983 to a structure in the Mariana Trench that appeared to be some kind of archive or library, a chamber containing what looked like crystalline storage systems, structures that held information in molecular configurations, memory systems that have been operating continuously for millions of years, maintaining record of Earth's history from perspectives humans had never imagined. The deep intelligence knew that humanity was developing technology at an exponential rate. It knew we were exploring space, splitting atoms, manipulating genetics, building computers. It recognized that we were approaching a threshold, a point where our technology would allow us to affect the entire planet in fundamental ways. And it wanted to establish a formal relationship before we reached that threshold, before we did something that might damage the ocean systems it relied on for its existence. The oceans weren't just habitat to the deep intelligence. They were its medium. The chemical balance of seawater, the circulation patterns, the temperature gradients, the distribution of minerals and nutrients, all of these factors affected its consciousness directly. Changes to the ocean weren't just environmental impacts. They were direct attacks on its cognitive substrate, like someone altering the chemistry of your brain while you were trying to think. And humans were changing the oceans, slowly at first, but accelerating. Industrial fishing that removed biomass the deep intelligence used for various purposes. Chemical pollution that altered water chemistry. Plastic waste that accumulated in deep ocean currents. The effects were still minor, still localized, but the trajectory was clear. In a few more decades, in a century at most, human activity would start affecting even the deepest trenches. Even the abyssal plains where the intelligence's main structures existed. The proposal was simple. The deep intelligence would share certain knowledge with humanity. Principles of engineering that could revolutionize material science. Information about molecular structures that could form the basis for room temperature superconductors. Programmable matter, energy storage systems with densities exceeding anything currently possible. Methods of energy generation that didn't require fossil fuels or nuclear reactions. Techniques for communicating across vast distances without electromagnetic radiation, using instead quantum entanglement principles that the intelligence had been using for millions of years. Access to archives containing Earth's history from a perspective humans had never known. Geological records showing the exact timeline of continental drift, climate changes, mass extinction events. Biological records tracking the evolution of every major organism group, with details about genetic changes and environmental pressures. Information that would revolutionize paleontology, evolutionary biology, geology, and dozens of other scientific disciplines. In return, humanity would agree to certain restrictions, limits on deep ocean exploitation, no mining of seafloor minerals in trench regions, no dumping of waste materials below certain depths, protocols for protecting abyssal ecosystems from the expansion of deep-sea fishing, agreements about weapons testing, and nuclear waste disposal in oceanic environments, monitoring systems to track ocean chemistry and ensure changes remain within acceptable parameters, and most importantly, acknowledgement, public recognition that humanity shares this planet with another intelligence, that we are not alone, that Earth has two conscious civilizations, not one, and that both have legitimate claims to planetary stewardship, a treaty between humans and something that wasn't human, between surface dwellers and an intelligence that lived in permanent darkness under crushing pressure, between civilizations separated by millions of years of evolutionary history and entirely different forms of consciousness. Dr. Zhao brought this proposal to Project Leviathan's director, Admiral Richard Halsey, in a meeting that lasted for 8 hours and was recorded despite her objections. She presented her translation of the Deep Intelligence's offer. She explained the benefits humanity would gain. She outlined the restrictions and what they would mean for various industries and government activities. Admiral Halsey listened, asked questions, requested clarifications, and then he asked a question that Dr. Zhao had been dreading. What happens if we refuse? Dr. Zhao admitted she didn't know. The Deep Intelligence hadn't communicated any explicit threats. It seemed to operate from an assumption that rational beings would recognize mutual benefit and accept reasonable terms. The concept of refusal might not be something it had seriously considered, but Admiral Halsey had spent 30 years in naval intelligence. He understood power dynamics. He knew that any negotiation contained implicit threats, and that often the most dangerous threats were the ones never spoken aloud. If the Deep Intelligence was offering this treaty, it meant they wanted something we could give, which meant we had leverage, which meant maybe the terms could be improved, or maybe we didn't need a treaty at all if we could develop countermeasures. He thanked Dr. Zhao for her work, told her the proposal would be forwarded to higher authority, and classified her reports at a level that prevented her from discussing them with anyone outside a group of approximately 12 people in the entire U.S. government. Project Leviathan's leadership brought this proposal to the highest levels of government, to President Ronald Reagan and his National Security Council, to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, to intelligence directors and scientific advisors and specialists in international law and treaty negotiation. The debates were intense and extended over months of classified meetings in secure facilities. Some argued for accepting the treaty. Senator Patricia Morrison, who had access to the classified briefings despite being outside the executive branch, made impassioned arguments that the knowledge being offered could solve fundamental challenges facing humanity: energy scarcity, materials limitations, understanding of Earth's history and our place in it. The restrictions being requested were reasonable. She argued we should be protecting deep ocean ecosystems anyway. The treaty would formalize something we should be doing voluntarily. Others argued it was a trap. General Thomas Blackwood insisted that accepting would acknowledge an authority over Earth that wasn't human, that it would limit our sovereignty over our own planet, that it would set a precedent where human activity could be constrained by non-human entities. Today it's restrictions on ocean exploitation. Tomorrow it might be restrictions on space exploration or artificial intelligence development or any other area where this intelligence decides human progress threatens its interests. And some argue that the Deep Intelligence wasn't offering a treaty at all. It was delivering an ultimatum. CIA Director William Bradford presented analysis suggesting that the timing of the offer was significant. The intelligence had been observing humans for 300,000 years. It had watched our entire development from primitive hominids to technological civilization. It had never made contact before. Why now? Why this specific moment in human history? The answer, Bradford argued, was that we had finally developed technology that could threaten it. Nuclear weapons, deep sea drilling, submersibles that could reach the trenches. We were approaching the ability to affect the deep ocean environment significantly, and the intelligence was trying to constrain us before we became truly dangerous. The treaty wasn't cooperation, it was containment, and accepting it would mean acknowledging that we were the junior partner in this relationship. Security experts raised concerns about verification. How would we know if the intelligence was keeping its side of the agreement? How could we monitor its activities when they took place at depths we could barely reach? What if it was building weapon systems in the trenches right now while offering us treaty terms? What if the knowledge it offered was deliberately limited or subtly flawed, designed to lead our technology development down paths that serve its interests rather than ours? The debate reached a turning point when Dr. Zhao was asked to testify before a classified congressional committee. She spent 6 days answering questions about her contact experiences, about what she knew of the intelligence's capabilities, its intentions, its potential threat level. And on the final day, Senator Morrison asked her directly, "Do you trust it?" Dr. Zhao's answer, preserved in sealed testimony, was nuanced. She said she didn't think trust was the right framework. The intelligence wasn't human. It didn't have human motivations or human ethics. It operated from principles we couldn't fully understand, but she believed it was genuine in its offer, that it saw mutual benefit in formalizing a relationship, that it preferred cooperation to conflict, not because of moral considerations, but because cooperation was more efficient, more aligned with its long-term goals. But she also acknowledged she could be wrong, that her interpretation of the impressions and concepts transmitted during contact sessions might be flawed, that she was trying to translate experiences that had no reference point in human consciousness into language that could never fully capture what she had experienced. There was inherent uncertainty, irreducible ambiguity, and that ambiguity left room for error, for misunderstanding, for deception, if the intelligence was capable of it. In 1987, after 4 years of debate and analysis and strategic gaming and intelligence assessment, a decision was made. President Reagan signed National Security Decision Directive 298, classified above top secret under a compartmented program that exists in no public record. The directive established official U.S. policy regarding the deep ocean intelligence. The United States government would not formally accept the treaty, would not acknowledge the deep intelligence publicly, would not share its existence with other nations or international bodies, except under most extreme circumstances, would not agree to restrictions on ocean exploitation or any other limitation on sovereign rights to utilize planetary resources. Instead, Project Leviathan would be expanded and refocused. The mission would shift from exploration and communication to monitoring and containment. The deep ocean structures would be surveilled constantly using a new generation of autonomous monitoring systems. Sensor networks would be deployed across all major trenches. Any expansion or change in activity would be documented and analyzed in real time. And if the intelligence ever demonstrated hostile intent, plans were developed for response options that range from conventional weapons to specialized nuclear depth charges designed to function at extreme ocean depths. Dr. Zhao resigned from the project. Her resignation letter, which was leaked decades later through Freedom of Information Act requests that took 11 years of litigation to fulfill, expressed her belief that the government's decision was catastrophic, that refusing the treaty meant we were choosing confrontation over cooperation, that we were treating the oldest intelligence on Earth as a threat rather than a potential ally, that we were letting fear and paranoia drive policy decisions that would affect all of humanity for generations to come. She wrote, "We had an opportunity to join something vast and ancient, to become part of a relationship that could have elevated human understanding beyond anything we can currently imagine. The knowledge being offered wasn't just technological, it was epistemological. Ways of thinking about reality that could have transformed every field of human inquiry. And we refused because we couldn't tolerate the idea that something else might have legitimate claims to authority on this planet." She disappeared 3 weeks later. Officially, she retired and moved to a remote location where she wanted to pursue private research away from government oversight. She left no forwarding address, closed her bank accounts, sold her property through intermediaries, contacted no friends or family members to say goodbye. Unofficially, there are reports that she made one final unauthorized descent to the Mariana Trench. A maintenance technician at Project Leviathan's Pacific facility reported that submersible ORPHUS 31 was accessed during a night shift when no authorized operations were scheduled. Security footage from that night was corrupted, showing only static during the critical hours. But the submersible's internal logs, recovered later, showed a descent profile consistent with a dive to Challenger depth. Her submersible was recovered on the surface 48 hours later, empty its internal systems showing normal operation right up until the moment she disappeared. The emergency beacon was activated, allowing recovery teams to locate the vessel, but Dr. Zhao was gone. No signs of struggle, no indication of equipment failure. The submersible was sealed from the inside, pressurized normally, with no explanation for how someone could have left it at 7 miles depth. Her personal effects were found aboard, her research notes, her journals documenting her contact experiences, and a final message, handwritten on paper, sealed in a waterproof case. The message read simply, "I'm going home. Don't look for me. And please reconsider the treaty. You're making a mistake that humanity may not survive." Some within Project Leviathan believe she chose to stay, that the deep intelligence offered her something she couldn't refuse. Perhaps the opportunity to truly understand consciousness from a non-human perspective. Perhaps the chance to live in a state of awareness that humans normally can't access. Perhaps she was tired of translating experiences that couldn't be translated, explaining concepts that couldn't be explained, and she chose to stop trying. Others believe she was taken, that the intelligence was displeased with humanity's response and decided to keep the one human who had truly understood it. Whether as a hostage, a specimen, or something else entirely, no one could say. But the timing, immediately after the treaty refusal, suggested a connection. A very small group, those who had worked most closely with Dr. Zhao and had witnessed her final communications with the intelligence, believed something different. They believed she merged, that the deep intelligence offered her the possibility of becoming part of its distributed consciousness, of maintaining her individual awareness, while also connecting to something vast and ancient, and she accepted. This interpretation is based on comments she made in her final weeks with the project. She had described feeling increasingly disconnected from human consciousness. She said that after years of contact experiences, after countless hours of mental states where she interfaced with the intelligence, human thought patterns felt limited, constrained, like trying to think in 2 dimensions after experiencing 3. She told a colleague in a conversation that was recorded without her knowledge as part of security monitoring, humans think in lines, past to present to future, cause to effect, but consciousness doesn't have to be linear. The deep intelligence exists in a state where all moments are accessible simultaneously, where cause and effect are just different perspectives on the same event. And once you've experienced that, once you felt what it's like to think in those terms, you can't unknow it. You can't go back to experiencing reality as a sequence of discrete moments. Either way, she's gone. And with her went the best opportunity humanity had to communicate with a deep ocean intelligence in any meaningful way. The individuals who tried to continue her work, to act as contact specialists and translate the impressions transmitted during subsequent interaction attempts, failed to achieve anything close to her level of clarity and understanding. The intelligence seemed to recognize this. Contact attempts after Dr. Zhao's disappearance produced only fragmentary, ambiguous impressions. Nothing coherent, nothing useful. It was as if the intelligence had decided that if humanity wouldn't accept its preferred intermediary, if we wouldn't respect a person who had dedicated years to understanding it, then communication would continue only on the most minimal terms necessary. Since 1987, Project Leviathan has continued its monitoring mission. The structures in the trenches remain active. They continue to show energy signatures and organized patterns that suggest ongoing operations. Electromagnetic emissions are detected regularly. Seismic profiles indicate internal processes that might be equivalent to manufacturing, computing, or other technological activities. The network appears to be expanding, though whether this is in response to human activity or part of some long-term project we can't determine. New structures are detected every few months. They appear suddenly fully formed, with no evidence of construction activity that our sensors can detect. One day a region of seafloor is empty. The next day there's a structure 30 meters tall with internal spaces and external features that serve purposes we can't identify. The speed of construction suggests capabilities far beyond anything human engineering can achieve. There have been incidents. Ships disappearing in deep ocean regions with no wreckage ever found, no distress calls, no survivors. The maritime insurance industry has noted statistical anomalies. Certain shipping routes that pass over deep trenches show higher loss rates than comparable routes in shallower waters. The difference is small, just a few percent, but consistent across decades of data. Submarines reporting equipment failures and unusual acoustic contacts in abyssal waters. Naval vessels that suddenly lose propulsion or steering while operating near trench regions, only to have systems inexplicably restore themselves hours later. The official explanations cite mechanical failures, electronic malfunctions, crew error, but the pattern is clear to anyone with access to the classified reports. Deep-sea cables carrying internet traffic show unexplained data corruption when they pass through trench regions. Packets are lost, signals are degraded, bandwidth drops mysteriously. The telecommunications companies blame geological activity, thermal variations, marine life interfering with cable infrastructure. But analysis of the corruption patterns reveals something more structured than random noise. Something that almost looks like intentional interference, or possibly attempts at communication using our own data networks. Oil rigs in deep water experiencing structural failures that don't match any known mechanical or geological cause. Platform legs collapsing despite being designed for pressures far exceeding what they should encounter. Drilling equipment failing at depths where it should function normally. Workers reporting strange sounds transmitted through the metal structures. Low-frequency vibrations that seem to carry meaning even though no one can identify what language is being used or what message is being sent. One incident in particular, designated Leviathan 47, occurred in 1994 when a deep-water oil platform in the Gulf of Mexico experienced what the operating company described as a catastrophic structural failure. All 83 personnel aboard were evacuated successfully before the platform collapsed into the ocean. The official investigation cited metal fatigue and design flaws. The classified investigation, conducted by Project Leviathan personnel, who examined the wreckage and interviewed witnesses under secrecy agreements, revealed something different. Multiple workers reported seeing something large moving in the water around the platform in the hours before the collapse. Something that created bioluminescent patterns in the deep water. Something that appeared to be examining the platform's structure, analyzing its support systems, determining its vulnerabilities. The platform's underwater cameras, recovered from the wreckage, captured 42 minutes of footage, showing what can only be described as a deliberate dismantling operation. The structural supports didn't fail randomly. They were systematically weakened in a sequence that caused controlled collapse, as if whatever was in the water understood engineering principles and applied them to eliminate a structure it found objectionable. The platform was drilling exploratory wells in a region directly above a mapped structural complex belonging to the Deep Intelligence. The drilling hadn't reached depths that would have directly threatened the structures, but the trajectory suggested that eventual production wells would extend deep enough to potentially interfere with whatever operations the intelligence was conducting. The message was clear: this is our territory. Your surface activities are tolerated, but if you attempt to access the deep ocean in ways that threaten our infrastructure, we will respond. And we have the capability to destroy any installation you place in our domain. Are these incidents related to the Deep Intelligence? Are they warnings? Demonstrations of capability? Responses to specific human activities that cross unacknowledged boundaries? Random accidents that we're overinterpreting because we know something is down there watching us? No one can say for certain, but the correlation is concerning. The incidents cluster around regions where Project Leviathan has detected the most activity, where the structures are most dense, where the intelligence appears to be most concentrated. Current analysis suggests that the Deep Intelligence is patient but not passive. It's observing our technological development. It's monitoring our impact on ocean ecosystems. It's tracking our military activities, our resource extraction, our pollution patterns. It's cataloging everything we do that affects the deep ocean environment. And it's maintaining the capacity to respond if we cross whatever threshold it has established. What form that response might take is unknown. The intelligence has demonstrated capabilities that we can barely measure, let alone counter. Its structures are built with materials we can't synthesize. It operates in environments that would kill any human instantly. It has control over biological systems through genetic engineering that's far beyond current human capability. It can create organisms designed for specific purposes. It can manipulate consciousness in ways we don't understand. It has had millions of years to develop technologies and methodologies that are completely outside our reference frame. Some researchers within Project Leviathan believe we're already at war. A Cold War fought in the deep ocean, with battles consisting of sensor deployments and counter-surveillance, of probe missions and evasion maneuvers, of gradual escalation that neither side wants to acknowledge openly. Others believe the intelligence is simply maintaining a baseline observation of a species it finds moderately interesting but fundamentally irrelevant to its long-term existence, that we're not threatening enough to warrant aggressive response and not interesting enough to justify cooperation. And there's a third perspective, held by those who knew Dr. Zhao best and who have studied her final communications most carefully. They believe the intelligence is sad, that it reached out to us hoping for companionship, for connection with another conscious entity in a universe where consciousness appears to be rare and precious. And we responded with suspicion and military preparations. We had a chance to join something vast and ancient, to become part of a planetary consciousness that has existed since the world's oceans formed. And we chose isolation instead. We chose to remain alone in our limited human perspective rather than risk expanding our awareness to include something truly alien. They believe Dr. Zhao understood this, that she saw what we were giving up, and that she made the choice we should have made collectively. But that's speculation, sentiment, the kind of thinking that gets dismissed in classified briefings focus on threats and capabilities and response options. Strategic planners don't want to hear about the emotional states of alien intelligences. They want to know capabilities, intentions, vulnerabilities. They want actionable intelligence that can inform policy decisions and military preparations. What we know for certain is this: the deep ocean, the abyssal zones that comprise the majority of Earth's aquatic environment, is not empty. It's not merely home to strange fish and geological formations. It contains intelligence, consciousness, an awareness that predates human civilization by hundreds of thousands of years and possibly predates the existence of life on land entirely. This intelligence has structures, networks that span the major ocean trenches, facilities that serve purposes we can only guess at, technology that's simultaneously biological and mechanical, organic and artificial, in ways that challenge our fundamental categories for understanding engineering and design, and has been watching us since we first stood upright and looked up at the stars, never realizing that the most profound mystery wasn't above us in space, but below us in the depths we couldn't reach. We evolved looking upward, dreaming of flight, aspiring to leave the surface and explore the cosmos, all while something vast and patient observed us from the crushing darkness of the deep ocean. Project Leviathan continues its work in absolute secrecy. The operational security is tighter than nuclear weapons programs, tighter than intelligence operations in hostile territories. Personnel are recruited from military and scientific communities with extreme vetting that includes psychological profiling, family background investigations, and continuous monitoring throughout their service. Information is compartmentalized so that no single individual outside the highest command structure knows the full scope of operations. A technician maintaining sensor equipment doesn't know what the sensors are detecting. An analyst examining sonar data doesn't know where that data was collected. A scientist studying biological samples doesn't know they came from organisms created by the deep intelligence. Everyone knows their specific task. No one knows the complete picture except the dozen people at the very top of the program. Families are told their loved ones work in ocean research, which is technically true, just incomplete. They're told the work is classified, which everyone accepts because military and scientific research programs are often classified. They don't know their family members are part of humanity's primary defense against a potential threat from the deepest parts of the ocean. They don't know about the structures, the intelligence, the failed treaty, the ongoing monitoring operation. The submersibles dive, the sensors record. The data is analyzed by teams who work in facilities that don't appear on maps, located on islands that are designated only by military grid coordinates, in buildings that are disguised as marine research stations or environmental monitoring facilities. And slowly, carefully, humanity builds its understanding of what lives in the deep, what watches from the darkness, what has been here all along. The current generation of monitoring equipment is far more sophisticated than what was available during the first ORPHUS missions. Autonomous underwater vehicles can remain at depth for months, collecting continuous data without requiring human presence. Distributed sensor networks track acoustic signatures, electromagnetic emissions, seismic activity, and chemical changes in the water. Satellite systems monitor ocean surface patterns that might indicate subsurface activity. And the intelligence knows it's being watched. Has to know the sensor deployments are too extensive to be invisible. Our submersibles are too loud, too crude to escape notice by something that has mastered deep ocean environments for millions of years. It tolerates our observations the way you might tolerate insects crawling on your arm. Mildly annoying, but not worth significant effort to eliminate unless they start biting. Recent analysis suggests the intelligence is accelerating certain activities. The rate of new structure detection has increased over the past decade. Energy signatures are stronger. The biological organisms serving various functions appear to be more numerous and more sophisticated. Whether this represents normal expansion, response to environmental pressures, or preparation for some future event, Project Leviathan's analysts debate constantly. Climate change is of particular concern. Ocean temperatures are rising. Chemistry is shifting as the seas absorb more carbon dioxide. Currents are changing in ways that could affect the deep ocean environments where the intelligence exists. If the intelligence relies on specific conditions for its consciousness to function properly, if its substrate requires particular chemical balances or temperature ranges, then the changes humans are causing to the ocean could represent an existential threat to it. And if it's facing existential threat, if it's in danger of its consciousness being disrupted or eliminated by human-caused climate change, then conflict becomes not just possible but likely. A species fighting for survival will use whatever means necessary to eliminate threats. The intelligence has been patient for millions of years, but patience has limits when existence itself is at stake. Some within Project Leviathan advocate for resuming contact attempts, for trying to reopen communications and discussing the current situation, for warning the intelligence about climate change impacts and offering cooperation on mitigation, for trying to restart the treaty negotiations that were abandoned in 1987. Others argue that showing fear or concern would reveal weakness, that the intelligence needs to understand that humanity will not be intimidated or constrained, that our development will proceed according to our priorities. And if the deep ocean intelligence finds this threatening, that's its problem to solve, not ours. The debate continues in classified meetings. Meanwhile, the ocean warms, the chemistry shifts, the currents change, and something vast and ancient watches from the abyss, tracking these changes, calculating their implications, making decisions about responses that we won't learn about until it's too late to affect the outcome. If you live near the ocean, if you've ever stood on a beach and looked out at the horizon where water meets sky, you've been above it, above the structures and the intelligence and the vast distributed consciousness that spans the abyssal plains. The water you were looking at extends down 7 miles in some places, down to regions of crushing pressure and total darkness, down to where the deep intelligence maintains its networks and conducts its operations and pursues goals we can barely comprehend. You've been observed, cataloged, assessed by something that understands you better than you understand yourself, because it's had millions of years to study your species while you've had only decades to study it. Every human who goes near the ocean, who swims in the waves or sails on the surface or sends sonar pulses into the depths, registers in its awareness, not as individuals necessarily. We might all just be data points in a vast analysis, samples in a study that's been running since before our ancestors learned to use fire. Some people report dreams, vivid dreams of descending through dark water, of pressure increasing until it feels like the weight of the world pressing down from all directions, of light fading from blue to black, of reaching a place where geometry becomes strange and physics seems negotiable, where straight lines curve, where cause and effect become simultaneous, where consciousness exists in states that don't match any human experience, of seeing eyes in the darkness, massive bioluminescent organs that glow with pale blue light, eyes that regard you with clinical interest, that analyze and categorize and file you away in archives that will outlast human civilization, and a feeling of presence that's simultaneously alien and familiar, as if you're remembering something you've never experienced, as if part of your consciousness has always been connected to something vast and ancient that exists in the deep ocean. Project Leviathan personnel are familiar with these dreams. They're a known phenomenon among those who have descended to trench depths, among those who have been in proximity to the structures, among those who have experienced the kind of consciousness-to-consciousness contact that Dr. Zhao specialized in. The working theory is that the deep intelligence has some ability to affect human consciousness at a distance, to create impressions or memories or experiences that manifest as dreams. The mechanism is unclear. It might be electromagnetic. The intelligence generates fields that can affect neural activity in human brains, even at significant distances. It might be quantum, some form of entanglement or correlation that allows consciousness to influence consciousness, regardless of physical separation. It might be something else entirely, some principle of how minds interact that we haven't discovered because human-to-human consciousness connection doesn't work this way. Whether these dream experiences are intentional communications or just side effects of being near an alien consciousness, no one can say definitively, but they persist. They spread. People who have never been to sea, who have never had any connection to Project Leviathan, who live in landlocked regions far from any ocean, sometimes report the same dreams, the same imagery, the same sense of descending into crushing darkness and finding something vast and aware waiting there. Psychological studies conducted on dream reports collected from the general population show consistent patterns. The dreams cluster around certain themes: descent, darkness, pressure, discovery of ancient structures or vast organisms, contact with an intelligence that communicates through direct mental impression rather than language. And almost universally, the dreams end with the dreamer feeling that they've been marked somehow, that they've been noticed by something that will remember them. Perhaps awareness itself creates connection. Perhaps by knowing about the deep intelligence, by thinking about it, by acknowledging its existence, we create some kind of link that allows it to touch our minds in subtle ways. Consciousness affecting consciousness at a distance. Not telepathy in any conventional science fiction sense, but something more fundamental, a property of awareness that exists at quantum levels. Correlation between mental states that persists regardless of physical separation. Or perhaps it's always been there, always been part of human consciousness in ways we don't recognize. Perhaps our myths of sea monsters and ocean gods, our fear of deep water and dark places, our fascination with the abyss, these aren't just evolutionary adaptations or cultural phenomena shaped by drowning risks and maritime disasters. Perhaps they're memories. Impressions left by millions of years of proximity to something vast and patient that lives beneath the waves. Our distant ancestors, living in coastal regions, fishing in shallow waters, crossing oceans in primitive vessels, they were closer to it than we are now. They spent more time in direct contact with the ocean, and maybe they felt something, sensed something, knew at some unconscious level that the deep waters contain awareness, intelligence, and that knowledge got encoded in our cultural memory, our collective unconscious, our species-wide understanding that the ocean is more than just water and marine biology. It's the realm of something else, something that watches, something that has always watched, since before we stood upright, since before we developed language, since the first hominids looked at the ocean and felt an instinctive fear that couldn't be explained by simple drowning risk. Project Leviathan has no answers to these questions, only more questions, more data that raises additional mysteries, more observations that suggest the relationship between human consciousness and the deep intelligence is more complex than simple them in the trenches, us on the surface geography. There are theories that consciousness itself might be non-local, that awareness doesn't exist purely in the physical structure of brains or neural networks. That is a phenomenon that exists across multiple scales simultaneously. Quantum, neural, social, maybe even planetary. If consciousness operates at multiple levels, if awareness can exist as distributed networks rather than isolated individuals, then maybe the boundary between human consciousness and the deep intelligence is more permeable than we think. Maybe we're already connected. Maybe we've always been connected. Maybe what Project Leviathan is trying to monitor and contain is actually just one manifestation of something that extends through the entire planetary biosphere. One node in a network that includes all conscious entities on Earth. And our attempts to separate ourselves, to maintain independence, to assert that human consciousness is fundamentally different and isolated from the deep ocean intelligence, are based on illusions about how awareness actually works. These are speculations that exist at the fringes of Project Leviathan's research, the kind of thinking that gets filed away in appendices to classified reports rather than incorporated into operational planning. But some researchers, particularly those in the Consciousness Studies Division, take these ideas seriously. They're conducting experiments, testing hypotheses, trying to map the boundaries of where human consciousness ends and something else begins. The results are inconclusive but suggestive. Meditation practitioners report increased sensitivity to what they describe as ocean presence when they reach certain states of consciousness. Individuals with no knowledge of Project Leviathan sometimes report spontaneous experiences of connection to something vast that exists in deep water. Statistical analysis of these reports shows correlations that exceed chance expectations. Maybe awareness is more connected than we realize. Maybe the deep intelligence isn't separate from humanity. Maybe it's part of a larger system of consciousness that includes us. And maybe our refusal of the treaty, our choice to remain isolated, was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what separation even means when dealing with consciousness that operates at scales we can barely comprehend. The deep calls, the pressure waits. The ancient intelligence observes from its realm of permanent darkness and crushing weight. And humanity continues its work on the surface, mostly unaware that we share this planet with something older, stranger, and possibly wiser than we can comprehend. Something that might actually be part of us in ways we don't recognize. That might be as essential to planetary consciousness as our own awareness. That might be trying to show us that separation is impossible when dealing with minds that exist in spaces larger than individual bodies or individual species. The deep calls, the pressure waits. The ancient intelligence observes from its realm of permanent darkness and crushing weight, and humanity continues its work on the surface, mostly unaware that we share this planet with something older, stranger, and possibly wiser than we can comprehend. This is Project Leviathan. This is the Mariana Intelligence Protocol. This is the truth that lives in the deep, the consciousness that predates our species, the ancient awareness that watches from the abyss. And now, for better or worse, you know it's there, 7 miles down, beyond the reach of light, in the crushing darkness where evolution took a different path and consciousness found a different form, where pressure would collapse human bodies like aluminum cans and temperatures hover just above freezing year-round, where no photosynthesis is possible and life depends entirely on chemical energy from volcanic vents and the slow rain of organic matter from the surface waters far above. In that hostile environment, in those conditions that seem designed to prevent complex organization and higher function, consciousness emerged, not built from neurons and synapses like human brains, not arising from evolutionary pressures that favored better visual processing or tool use or social cooperation, but from chemistry, from patterns in molecular interactions, from complexity that achieves self-awareness through pathways completely different from anything in terrestrial biology. Watching, always waiting, always aware of every ship that passes overhead, every sensor we deploy, every attempt we make to understand or control or contact what lives in the deep places of the world, tracking our technology development, analyzing our pollution outputs, monitoring our population growth and resource consumption, and the slow degradation of the ocean ecosystems that separate our world from its realm. The ocean keeps its secrets, but some secrets, once revealed, can never be forgotten. You can't unknow what you know. You can't pretend that the deep ocean is empty once you've learned about the structures, the intelligence, the consciousness that exists in the abyss. The world looks different when you understand that the most profound mystery of human history isn't in ancient ruins on land or in cryptic texts or in unexplained archaeological artifacts. It's 7 miles down, under crushing pressure, in darkness that has persisted since the oceans formed 4 billion years ago. It's been there all along. We just couldn't reach it, couldn't see it. couldn't comprehend that intelligence might take forms radically different from our own. That consciousness doesn't require brains or bodies or anything we'd recognize as biological organization in the conventional sense. And the deep intelligence knows this, knows that knowledge spreads, that awareness grows, that eventually humanity as a whole will have to confront what a small group of classified personnel have known for decades, that we will have to make collective decisions about how we relate to the ancient intelligence in the depths, that we will have to choose between cooperation and confrontation, between trying to understand something vast and alien or try to contain it, between accepting that we share this planet with another consciousness or insisting that human dominance extends even to realms we can barely access, that we are not alone on this planet, that intelligence exists in forms we barely recognize, that consciousness emerged not just on land but in the crushing darkness of the deep ocean trenches, in environments we thought were too hostile for anything beyond primitive organisms, in conditions that challenge our basic assumptions about what life requires and what awareness needs to develop and persist, and that our relationship with that ancient intelligence will define the future of both species in ways we're only beginning to understand. The decisions we make now, the policies we establish, the attitudes we adopt toward the deep intelligence, these will shape the trajectory of human civilization for centuries to come. We're at a pivot point, a moment where our choices actually matter on geological timescales. The treaty was offered, a genuine attempt at establishing formal relationship between two conscious civilizations sharing the same planet, terms that were reasonable by any objective analysis, knowledge exchange that could have revolutionized human technology, restrictions that asked only for basic respect for deep ocean ecosystems, recognition that both species have legitimate claims to planetary stewardship. We declined. We chose suspicion over cooperation, fear over curiosity, control over collaboration. We made a decision that future generations might view as the greatest missed opportunity in human history, or they might view it as necessary caution, as wisdom in the face of uncertain threats, as prudent defense of human sovereignty against entities whose ultimate intentions we can't verify. Whether that was wisdom or fatal error remains to be seen. History hasn't rendered its judgment yet. The consequences of our choice are still unfolding, still developing across decades and potentially centuries. We won't know if we made the right decision until much later, until we see how the deep intelligence responds to continued isolation, until we learn whether cooperation would have prevented disasters or whether isolation protected us from subtle manipulation by something we couldn't fully understand. But the deep doesn't forget. The intelligence is patient in ways that span geological epochs. It existed before human civilization and will likely exist after human civilization ends. Its time horizon is measured not in years or decades or even centuries, but in millions of years. In scales where the entire span of recorded human history is just a brief moment, a single data point in a vast analysis of how consciousness develops and evolves and interacts across different forms. And the structures continue to grow in the trenches where pressure would crush our strongest vessels and darkness has reigned since the world was young. New facilities appear, energy signatures strengthen, biological systems become more sophisticated. The network expands steadily, slowly, with the patience of something that is all the time in the world because it operates on geological rather than human timescales. This is what Project Leviathan knows. This is what they monitor. This is the burden they carry in silence. The knowledge that can't be shared. The truth that must remain classified because its revelation would transform human civilization in unpredictable ways, would cause panic, religious crises, philosophical upheavals, political chaos, would force every human being to confront the reality that we are not the sole intelligence on this planet, that we never were. Every day, personnel and facilities that don't officially exist analyze data from sensors that aren't in any equipment inventory. They track movements and energy patterns and biological developments in regions of the ocean that are designated as restricted zones in classified databases. They maintain the watch, the vigil, the constant observation of something vast and ancient that watches us in return. They know that somewhere in the crushing darkness of the deep ocean trenches, decisions are being made that will affect humanity's future. Calculations are being performed. Analyses are being updated. The deep intelligence is observing our climate change impacts, our technological development, our population growth, our ocean pollution. It's measuring how these trends affect its own existence, and it's planning responses that we won't learn about until they manifest in ways we can detect. They know that the treaty refusal might have started a countdown, that the intelligence's patience, vast as it is, might have limits when its own survival is at stake. That at some point in the future, near or far, the deep intelligence might decide that humanity has crossed a threshold, has caused too much damage, has become too much of a threat, and that decision could lead to consequences we're utterly unprepared to face. But they also know there's no simple answer, no obvious path to guaranteed safety. Accepting the treaty would have meant constraints on human activity, limits on resource exploitation, recognition of non-human authority over portions of our own planet. That comes with its own risks, its own potential for disaster if the intelligence's true intentions aren't what they appear to be. So they maintain the monitoring, they track the changes, they document the expansions, they analyze the patterns, they try to predict what the deep intelligence might do next. They develop contingency plans for scenarios ranging from peaceful coexistence to open conflict. And they wait. The deep calls. And somewhere in the darkness, something answers. Something vast. Something ancient. Something that has been part of this planet since water first accumulated in ancient ocean basins. Something that watched the first primitive cells emerge from chemical soups near volcanic vents. That observed the explosion of complex life. That witnessed the rise and fall of countless species across hundreds of millions of years. Always has, always will, always watching, always calculating, always aware of the brief, bright flicker of human civilization on the surface of a planet it has inhabited for billions of years. Watching us with interest perhaps, or with concern, or with the clinical detachment of a scientist observing a moderately interesting organism that might or might not prove significant in the long run, until the day we're ready to truly listen, until we develop the wisdom to understand that intelligence takes many forms, that consciousness doesn't require biology like ours, that other minds exist in this universe and on this planet, and that our choice isn't between human dominance and submission to alien authority, but between isolation and relationship, between trying to control everything or learning to coexist with things we can't control, between insisting the universe conforms to our expectations or adapting our understanding to match what actually exists. The ocean covers 71% of Earth's surface. The deep ocean, below 1,000 meters where light cannot penetrate, comprises 95% of all livable space on this planet. We've explored approximately 5% of it in any meaningful detail. The rest remains unknown, unmapped, unexplored. And in that vast, dark, unexplored realm, something lives, something thinks, something watches, something that knew this planet before humans existed and will likely know it long after we're gone. Something that represents consciousness in a form so different from our own that simply comprehending its existence requires expanding our definitions of what minds can be. This is the truth Project Leviathan guards. This is the knowledge they cannot share. This is the burden that weighs on everyone who knows. The weight of understanding that changes how you see the ocean, how you think about humanity's place in the natural world, how you understand consciousness itself. And now you carry that burden too. You know what lives in the deep. You know that the ocean is more than water and fish and geological formations. You know that intelligence exists in forms you've never imagined, that consciousness found paths to emergence that have nothing to do with evolution as we understand it on land. You know, and you can never unknow. The secret is part of you now, part of how you understand the world. And every time you see the ocean, every time you think about the deep waters and the crushing darkness in the ancient trenches, you'll remember something is down there, something vast and patient and aware. Something that has been there all along, something that watches, something that waits, something that might one day decide that humanity has finally become interesting enough to engage with directly, or dangerous enough to eliminate, or worthy enough to accept as partners in planetary stewardship. The deep calls, The ancient consciousness persists, the watch continues, and humanity stands at a threshold, trying to decide who we want to be, what kind of species we want to become, whether we can learn to coexist with intelligence that's radically different from our own. The answer will define our future, shape our destiny, determine whether we survive as a technological civilization or whether we're just another brief experiment in consciousness that the deep intelligence observes, catalogs, and eventually watches fade into extinction. 7 miles down, in the Mariana Trench, in the Tonga Trench, in every deep ocean environment where pressure and darkness create conditions that seem hostile to everything we understand about life, consciousness waits, ancient, patient, aware, and watching to see what humanity does next